Hello, my name is Hans Thompson of the Friends of the New London Public Museum.
And I'm Judy McDaniel from the New London Historical Society and also a friend of the New London Museum.
Bud Stern will be celebrating his 100th birthday on November 3rd.
And recently, Hans and myself sat down with Bud to talk about his memories growing up in New London and a century of stories about the city. Actually, Bud has lived his entire life in New London other than when he was in service, and he's lived in the same home for 75 years. We enjoy talking to Bud because he knows so much about the history and the progress of New London. He's owned several businesses and has been involved in a lot of civic organizations. So we hope that you will enjoy the presentation as much as Hans and I have enjoyed visiting with him.
Thank you.
My mother died when I was a year and a half old, and I was the youngest of 6 children. And we lived in Manawa on the farm, and after my mother died, my father and the family moved here to New London, and I have been a resident of New London ever since. Lots of things have happened in this city since I can remember going to the high school, and we had a great time there. The city, over a period of years, it really grew. A lot of businesses changed hands. I can remember the night that the Catholic Church burnt down. I can remember the night that there's a big fire across the road from the Grand Theater that burned out. It's now was Gordy's Carpet Shop.
Sport Electric used to be there?
Yeah, Sport Electric. It was there. They rebuilt the building. And, then I was on the fire department for quite a few years in New London. And we had both bowling alleys burned down. We had several big fires. We had a good fire department, but you can't always save the buildings when they're old.
Actually, Bud has lived in the same house for 75 years.
Yes, I've lived in this house ever since Kate and I got married. And Kate was Catherine McNichols before, and we were married on May 22nd, 1943. And from that time on, I was in service at that time. And we put up several years there in service. Prior to that, I went to school in St. Louis at the Lexington Brothers Hospital. I became a male nurse, and I worked. First jobs I had, I worked in Chicago for a short period of time. Then I went out to California, and I worked for GE on the dam. I lived in Las Vegas at the El Rancho Hotel. And then I worked for General Electric at the Hoover Dam, yes, doing industrial nursing. And then Pearl Harbor came along, and I gave them 2 weeks' notice and came back home, and I was going to enlist in the service. My cousin Bernie Stern and his dad took us over to Green Bay to enlist. Well, they accepted him. They rejected me because of my eyes. So, but then later on that year, I was drafted, and I went into the service, and I was there for 4.5 years. I spent time in Europe. I landed on D+5 at Utah Beach on the invasion. I spent time in a field hospital, and I had a very interesting 18 months over there. I came home, and the second day I was home, Kate and I walked downtown, and Bill Schmidt, one of the owners of Quality Markets, he and Fritz Berniger owned Quality Markets. Bill came out of the store and he said, "Hi, when did you get home?" And we talked, and he said he was going over to Manawa to get some butter and wanted to know if we'd ride along. Well, Kate and I, we both knew Bill very well, and we rode along, and on the way over there, he asked me if I'd like a job, and I said, "Well, I got one." And then he talked about it a little bit, and so Kate and I talked it over, and I decided I would take that job, and I became a butcher. Well, eventually, Bill and Fritz dissolved partnership, and I became Bill Incorporated, and I became one of the officers. He was the president. I was the vice president. Kate was the secretary, and Alice, Bill's wife, was the treasurer. And we operated like that. We had 5 other stockholders, and a year later we bought them out, and it ended up just Bill and I were in there. And Bill had a heart attack shortly after that, and I took over complete management of the stores, and I ended up, then Bill had a heart attack out at his cottage, and he passed away, and I ended up as the owner of the Quality Markets.
You had the north side and the south side, right?
Yes, we had the north side and the south side, and then we moved into we bought the Structo building, as they called it at that time. The city owned it, and we bought it from the city. And we moved our north side store into that one, and during that period of time, the stores all were starting. They were just, the supermarkets were just starting. Before that, the stores were all smaller stores. Some I can remember in Appleton, the first big store they had over there was Crambo's. And that was about the time that we went into that building. And then shortly after that, about a year after that, Bill passed away, and I took over the ownership of the stores. And then we built the liquor store on the front of the building.
That's where the furniture store is now?
Yes, that's
right.
where the furniture store is right now. And then I had that for several years, and I was buying groceries from Piggly Wiggly, and they approached me and wanted to buy it out, and so I sold it to them, and I retired at the age of 53. And shortly after that, we sold the liquor store. Tom Schubert had been running it since we put it in.
Tom would be your son-in-law, that's right.
Right, Tom was my son-in-law. And he left and went to work for Kerwood, and then he left and went to work for Kimberly Clark. But the store was sold, and Kate and I just enjoyed life from that time on until she passed away. And I became very involved with church work. I was an officer in the Most Precious Blood Church for years, and I was also very much involved in the Knights of Columbus. I was a controller for the Eastern District of Wisconsin, the 4th Degree Knights of Columbus, for 20-some years, and well, finally, that's up to date. Is pretty much what I did in life as far as my life in New London was concerned. During this period, I bought out most of the little stores. They came to me and they were going out of business, and they all had a few groceries left and stuff, and I would buy them all. Friday nights was the biggest day of the week as far as business was concerned. All the stores, including the dry goods stores, Christie's and Vandry's, they were very, very busy on Friday nights. And parking places were hard to find on the main street.
You'd go down North Water Street, and cars were parked in every spot, and people were sitting in their cars, right?
They were.
People were walking downtown, and they'd stop and visit with people that were parked on the street.
Yes, they'd watch. They were.
Friday night.
They would be the people walking down the street would stop and talk to the people sitting in the cars. That was the funniest part of it.
Yeah, it sure was.
And we used to get, at that time in the summer, we got a lot of tourist trade, and people going up to the north. We had regular customers that stop every Friday night, coming from Chicago and Milwaukee and whatnot. Well, that time Highway 45 went well. Actually, at first it was Highway 26. It went right through the main street of town. So the restaurants were very busy. Like I can remember Dutch Miller had a restaurant in what is now the Malarkey Building. And
that's where the high school kids hung out.
Oh, they hung out there, yeah.
Like to sit in the booth in the window.
Yes, they hung out there. We had an alarm system throughout the city. I had a big alarm clock upstairs in the house here, and I had one at the store. So what had happened when they would get the call, Matt Nesbitt would push a button. He lived at the upstairs above the fire department, and he was the driver for the truck. And he would push this button that would also alert the boarding company, who would blow the whistle. They had the whistle down there at steam. They had a constant steam pressure all the time, and they would blow the siren there. But these alarms would all ring in the fire departments. Okay, if I was home here, I could pick up the telephone and say, Fireman Stern, and the operator, they had a switchboard at that time. The operator would tell us where the phone was. Now, if I was at somebody else's house and I heard the siren from Borden's, I would pick up the telephone and I would click it, just on and off, on and off, on and off. And that would, because otherwise the operators would not answer the telephone.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They were waiting for the firemen to. It was a cooperation between the operators and the fire department, and it worked out well. This was at Prahl's bowling alley in the north side. Well, it was, like I said, it was so cold, and when we actually, after we got the fire out, I tried to take off my raincoat, and I couldn't take it off because it was so covered with ice, and the buckles were just solid ice that we walked down. Gus Ferg and I both are having trouble, and we walked down to the fire station, and we got underneath the shower with our raincoats on to melt the ice off so we could get the raincoats off. Yeah, that was that. Then I had another episode that was kind of funny. We were at a fire out in Northport, and I had just gotten a brand new red, actually Mackinac coat, and I was out the fire there, and well, it was a house fire, and I thought it was water running off the roof, and well, it turned out to be tar, and it was running just down my back. Well, I couldn't go home like that, so when I noticed what it was, we were leaving, coming back to New London. They had the fire truck stop in front of buses dry cleaning, and I took my jacket in it because Kate would have killed me, I think, if she'd seen it. But that was just so covered with tar in the back there. And, well, that was a good episode there, showing how you ruined your clothes and whatnot. Well, I can tell you, my grandmother and my aunt lived over on Warren Street. And next door to them was Earl Blink. And Earl Blink worked for the Wieners. And they had a garage. My Uncle Bill was a carpenter. He built that house, and he also built the garage later on. And that garage was what you would call maybe a 2.5 car garage or bigger. It had a elevator over in the corner, and it's built like a tool shed, just to put tools inside there. And the elevator came up from the basement right where the foundation was of that room, and you couldn't see it. And that elevator was not connected, or that room was not connected to the other basement. And the switches were in the house. And they would come there with their trucks at night, Wieners, and I understand that's what they call the cutting station. They would rebottle. They'd bottle some of their alcohol downstairs in that room. And they'd always post a lookout out there. Well, my grandmother had a flower garden right alongside of the house there, or the driveway. And they'd post a lookout man there, and he is standing in the driveway, or in the flower bed all the time, and knocking down her flowers. And she told her son, who was Al Stern, was the policeman, she told him about it. Well, the next day after she told him, Al must have talked to Wieners that night. Next day, Louis Wiener drove into her driveway and says, "Mrs. Stern," he says, "those men will never be standing in your flower garden anymore." And he gave her a case of beer and a quart of alcohol. A lot of people worked for the Wieners. They did. It was a big business. They operated, their headquarters was here, yes, but they operated out of La Crescent. I don't know where else in town. They had what they call the Brown House, which I know which one it is. It's over by the old high school. And they had the one out by the brick house, out by used to be Hawker's Brickyard, and Don Supper Club out there. Right. You know, things were tough at that time. That was right at during the Depression. Things really got tough, And like the people at the plywood, they were making $10 to $12 a week. And I was making that much setting pins at Prawl's Bowling Alley. I was making $10 to $12 a week. And I worked at the, sometimes I set pins, sometimes I worked behind the counter as a soda jerker and whatnot. But in the 4 years I was in high school, I worked for Ray Prawl in the store there. I did a lot of work for him. And it came very much in handy. But like I said, the people that were working at the factory, I had brother-in-laws down there. They were making 10 and 12 bucks a week, and that's how they lived. And, maybe my dad always had a job, so maybe we were just fortunate, I guess. I don't know, but a lot of them didn't have. The only industry we really had here in New London at that time was boardings and the plywood.
And plywood had 3 plants then.
Yeah, well, at that time they only had one, but then when they started coming out of the Depression, then they had they took over the old shoe store or shoe shop, or shoe factory, and they took over a building down at the Edison, and they had their main plant. And they were the main industry, but the wood industry has always been low-paid industry.
Tell us about the most well-traveled cow.
Yeah.
Oh, the most well, yes, they had a cow that actually they had a cattle truck. They used it for delivery with a false floor, and they could fill in the under there they could put in alcohol, and they had it in tins. Their alcohol was always in square tins, and I think they were 5-gallon cans. I think they were 5 or 10 gallons. I think they were 5-gallon cans. I never saw them, to tell you the truth, but I heard about them. And they just slid those in the floor, and they had this cow in there, and they just traveled. They'd all over the state of Wisconsin and Minnesota, basically. I don't think that they didn't use that for delivery down to Chicago. They had 2 cars. Don Blink drove one, and Leo drove the other. And they delivered to I asked Buck, I said, well, that was Buck Blink. I said, well, how often did you see Al Capone? He says several times. He saw Al Capone.
What can you tell us about some of the doctors in town, like Doc Pfeiffer?
Well, Doc Pfeiffer was my friend. My aunt worked for him. He used to, lots of times, if he's going out in the country, he'd stop and pick me up. I'd ride with him out on his house calls out in the country. And he bought me my first bicycle. He was just a great guy. But now, the other doctors in town, there were 2 families, the Borkerts and the Monsteds, and both of them, their fathers, they started out in town here. Dr. Monsted, I knew of him. I didn't know him very well. I'm talking about the father. Now Dr. Borkert, I remember him. He lived on the corner where the villa is now. His office, his home and office was there in his house.
In the villa, right?
No, not in the villa.
But did he start the villa?
He after his house was there first, and then when the community hospital came, when the nuns came here, and they were just down the block here on the corner of Quincy and Algoma, and they went or Dr. Pfeiffer actually was instrumental in bringing the nuns here. They had a hospital in Antigo, and then they came down here, and they used that house on El Goma down here. They used that house as a hospital, and they stayed at the sister's house on the Most Precious Blood. And then they got enough money to go and start the hospital, build the hospital on, Mrs. Small owned that property. Now, it's my understanding that she donated the property because she lived there after the hospital was built. She lived there. They made it her home. Now, and then she had the big garden where the Ascension is now. She had a big garden there that she would grow vegetables for the hospital. And, well, that's about as much as I know about the hospital. The nuns were from Canada. I worked there. I did work at the hospital for a year. What happened, Dr. Pfeiffer came over. It was right after I graduated from high school. And jobs were hard to come by at that time. You were lucky if you could get a job. And he stopped over the house and he said, say, Mrs. Small needs some help gardening. So if you want to go up there, so I did. I went up there. And I got the job of gardening for $1 a day. And I worked one day, and Sister Hickey, the Mother Superior, came out, and she said to me the next morning, would you like to be the orderly in the hospital? And I said, well, I didn't have to think twice about that. I didn't know, sure and heck was better than being outside in the hot sun. So I took the job as the orderly, and I worked there for a year before I went to school in St. Louis. We had, prior to Dr. Pfeiffer, there was a Dr. Brown. Now, he lived down on Wolf River Avenue, where Stub Brown lived. That was, I don't know much about him. He was retired, or when I was young, I think he was retired already or semi-retired. But he was one of the first doctors that I understood before Dr. Pfeiffer. We also had, when the hospital started here, this was actually the only hospital around outside of Appleton. And the doctors from Clintonville, Waiwega, Wapaka, Bear Creek, Marion, they all came to the New London Hospital. Hortonville was between half and half, I would say. Some came to New London, others went to Appleton, St. E's. Dr. Pfeiffer was a very, very good surgeon. He was, of all the surgeons that I worked with, I would say Dr. Pfeiffer was right near the tops. And I worked with a lot of surgeons, especially in the war. He's a rough old man, him and his cigars. He always had a cigar he was chewing on. He didn't smoke them, he chewed them.
What can you tell us about the beginning of Hillshire?
Hillshire? Okay. There was a meat market on the corner of Spring Street. It was right across from the library. There was a meat market owned by Frank Jennings. He hired Fritz Berninger. Fritz Berninger came from Austria. He came to Minneapolis, and from Minneapolis he worked up there for Cudahy. He went down in Milwaukee for Cudahy Brothers. I think it was Cudahy Brothers. And then he came up here, actually came to Appleton to work for Hoffensberger. And then he was hired as a sausage maker by Frank Jennings. He was a young man at that time. He came here when he was 19 years old. He came to Canada when he was 19 years old. He was a sausage maker. And Bill Schmidt quit high school as a freshman. And he went to work for Frank Jennings delivering meat. He used a coaster wagon. They walked around, delivered to the houses. And anyway, then he got working in the meat department, became a butcher. And one day they got together, Fritz and Bill, and they said, let's buy this guy out. Well, I guess Frank Jennings was ready to get out of the business. So anyway, they did Bill borrowed it from his father-in-law, a man by the name of Thorstenson. He borrowed the money from him. I don't know how many hundreds, a few $100s. It wasn't much, because all they had to buy was the equipment for a butcher shop, which would just be the knives and the saws. And at that time, they didn't have power saws or anything. They had a grinder, yes, but they didn't have a power saw. And they bought the equipment, and they started in. Gradually, their business increased, and the building next door, which had been a bowling alley, and Ray Prall's, they moved into that building. They rented it from Walter Shanerock owned it. They rented that building. They did their slaughtering of animals. Some of them, the small animals, they did in the back room of the store. There was room there to do it. And the big animals, the cows, they rented the slaughterhouse from Frank Jennings. That building is still available. I think it's owned by Terry Dorschner. It's done in that Terry Dorschner property near Kerwood. They rented that building. They had an argument with Frank Jennings, and he locked them out. This is when they moved to that other building. They had an argument, and he locked them out. Then there was an old slaughterhouse down near Mud Lake. I have some pictures of that, and they rented that old from, I can't remember who the man was that owned it. Anyway, they rented that, and then they killed their cattle, their cows down there. Then that was just an old one, and they were looking for something different, and they bought 5 acres of land where Hillshire now is. They bought 5 acres of land from Oscar Hitty, and they built their first packing house, which was a small single-room building. And then they had the store. They bought out the North Side store. They bought from Jim Mulhaney, And that was also in the building that was owned by Frank Jennings. And they were in that building, well, they prospered during World War II. They supplied the Fox Valley with fresh meat, and they prospered. They did very much. They legally or illegally, regardless of what it was, they killed a lot of hogs and a lot of beef. And they were at that time, they were on a quota business from the government. The government says you can only kill so many. And then after the World War II, during this time there, they built on and built on and built on. They were always adding something. And in 1945, that's when I started working there. And they were, at that time, all they had out the packing house, though, was Fritz Berninger, Herman Brennerstuhl, Leroy Peterson, Jim Mahaney Jr., and I think two of the Hitty boys. And that was their crew at that time. And then from that time on, they did nothing but grow. Now that was how they got started and where they are today. Now the Berningers do not have anything to do with it anymore. Bill Schmidt and Schmidt and Berninger dissolved partnership. So that's where they are. Now you also ask about Kerwood. Well, Kerwood, when they came to town, Bob Woods and Howard Curler, they were, I think it was Nina Paper, I'm not sure on that, where they worked. But they came to town here, they had an idea on plastics, and they rented the old ice and fuel business building.
Kenny Brighting had that.
Yeah, Kenny Brighting had that, the ice and fuel business. That's down just behind the post office, so you can see on Wolf River Avenue. And that's where they started in, and they had ideas, I guess, on plastic, and then they moved from there across the river to the building of DeGroth, I think, owned that building. And then they wanted to build, and I think the city bought that property where they are at the present time out there. I think the city bought that and as an industrial park, and they sold them the property for the plant. Now, the businessmen in New London started New London Opportunities Incorporated. And the businessmen became, if they donated or bought stock, you bought stock in that, they used that money to go and finance Kerwood building. Howard Curler himself was a very strong-minded individual, very, very strong-minded. He had his ideas, and don't stand in my way. I really enjoyed talking to him and calling him a friend. He was, he'd tell you what he had on his mind, and very emphatic, and he became a very strong, and well, then Kerwood went and bought out Bemis. I don't know if Bemis bought out Kerwood or Kerwood. I think Bemis bought out Kerwood. Anyway, they joined, and that's where they got the word Bemis, because Bemis was a paper bag company, a packaging company, and they had lots of things going out there at Kerwood. They had a strike, and they had a union out there, and they had a strike, and it didn't work out very well for Howard. He settled the strike and said, "What do you want? That's it." But that's it, and that was it too. Then they went and, rather than build that plant in Oshkosh here, they built it in Oshkosh, non-union plant, and that's what they are today.
So I've heard about 3 different theaters in town. There was the Grand Theater, the Merrimack, and then there was a drive-in theater. What can you tell me about some of the theaters in New London?
Okay, I can start with the Merrimack. Okay, in my growing up, I lived with the Wilkie family, Bill Wilkie, and he was an electrician. And he worked at the plywood. He was an electrician for the plywood, but he also had a electrical business, and he did the electrical work at the Merrimack. And they used to have big Saturday. Actually, they were continuous, like Tom Mix and all different Western stories and whatnot. And every week you'd go there and continue next week, and they that one, well, it was a small theater. They always say you go there, you get dust in your eyes, and
Smell the horse manure.
smell the horse manure.
And that was the joke.
That was the joke, yes.
Because there was always 2 movies, right?
Yeah.
Like the Three Stooges and then a cowboy movie.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And well, that building, I know that it was owned by, I think it was, I don't know if it was owned by Dr. Lyons or who owned the building, but they had down in the basement of it, somebody had carved, they had wood posts holding up the floor, and somebody had carved those. They were like a totem pole. There were really a lot of beautiful carvings in there. And well, it finally closed. Actually, I think they put the drive-in first, and that was out past Walmart. The buildings are still there yet. The protection building and the other one, they're still there. That was, I think it was successful during the war. I'm not sure. I was out of town for 10 years, going to school and working and being in the service. So I was out of town for 10 years here, and some of those things happened. They tore I don't know, just when they tore the theater, the walk-in or drive-in theater down. Now the Grand, that has always been the Grand from the time I was a little kid. I remember we used to have Buster Brown shoe deals down there. Oh gosh, that was something. If you had Buster Brown shoes on, you could get in for nothing, and Christie's had sold Buster Brown shoes. But that theater has always been very attractive. It has, even for a while, they had high school graduations down there when they were building Washington High School. They had like I said, graduations were held there. It was just a very old and very nice. I can remember they had that orchestra pit down there. I can remember the organ. It had the sound. Sound. What do they call them? The sound. Movies, silent movies. They had those, and they had the orchestra would play along with it. Then they had a organist. Oh gosh, all that stuff is in the past, and right now it's a very attractive building. Oh, how'd I meet Kitty? Well, to begin with, I just lived across the street here. Yeah, the second house. And, well, this whole neighborhood, we all walked to school together. She was a year ahead of me in school. But we all walked to school together. There were a lot of kids in this neighborhood. And, well, I never, outside of walking to school with her, that was it. We never went out or talked about a date or had a date or anything like that. It was, but I came home from, when I came home from California, or from Las Vegas, I was going to the movie one night, and her mother was sitting out on the porch. And I stopped, and I was walking down the town, and I was talking to her mother, and she came out of the house, and she was talking, and when I got home and whatnot, and finally I said, say, I'm going to the movie. You want to go along? Well, we went to the movie, and that started a relationship with us, and we went from that point on till, then I was drafted, and but I still came home. When I was drafted, I went to Camp McCoy. No, I went to Camp Sheridan, and I was on my way to Camp McCoy. And I came home for the weekend, and well, we started to get more serious, I guess, and from that time on, I came home every week. Once I got to Camp McCoy, I came home every week, and finally, about a year later, we got married, and well, that was that was something else. We decided we were going to go to. Well, they told me I would never leave. I would never, because of my eyes, I would never go overseas, or I'd stay there at Camp McCoy for, you know, we went and I rented an apartment, and we came home. I came home and went back on a Sunday night, went to the apartment. And Monday morning, it goes out to camp, and it goes into the orderly room. The old man says, where the hell you been? He's been looking for you. You're moving out tomorrow. I said, what? Yeah, being transferred. Transferred to Camp Ellis, Illinois. Well, we spent 2 nights in our apartment, and then we moved to Camp Ellis. Well, she says, I'm not going back home. So she went right with me, or she came down there, and that was near Canton, Illinois. It's in the center of the state. It's a new camp. And we were there 2 weeks, and we moved to Colorado Springs, or Camp Carson, Colorado, and well, from that time on, I mean, she just said, I'm not going back home. So that's what it was. We were together all the time until I went overseas, and that was it. That's how we met, and that's pretty much what happened.
How many children did you have?
I have 2, Mary and Mike. Mike's the oldest. Mike was born when I was overseas, and he was what was it? Mike was 18 months old before I saw him. He was born while I was overseas, and yeah, he was 18 months old before I saw him. And then and Mike he's a nuclear engineer and an attorney. He lives out in Maine. He's retired. Mary lives here in town. Her husband passed away. Her husband was a Vietnam War veteran. He died of Agent Orange. And she's retired from the New London School District. And I have the grandchildren. I have 4 grandchildren. Mary had a boy and a girl, Susie and Ted. Mike had 2, a boy and a girl. And that's Matt and Christine. And I have 3 great-grandchildren. My family has, they all lived to a good ripe age. My grandfather lived, well, at that time, 80s were considered good. And he lived in his late 80s. He was a Civil War veteran. He lived in his late 80s. My grandmother lived in her late 80s. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side, they lived into their, I think one of them was in the 90s. So, and my dad lived to be 97. Yes, my mother died when I was a year and a half old, but she died of a kidney infection. So I guess I have a sister that lived to be 102. One lived in, well, they all lived into, no, my one sister didn't. She had cancer and she died in her 60s. The others all lived in their 90s. It's been a great life. It has been. I've been fortunate. I retired very young. I mean, at 53, I retired very young, and we did nothing but travel. And some of the things I did after I retired were, I did a lot of traveling. I met a lot of people. Like when I was a controller for the Knights of Columbus, I met people from the Michigan line to the Illinois line, and beyond that, as far as it goes. But I made a lot of friends, and I had a lot of experiences, and they meant so much to me. Like if you go up into my office and see the albums I have there of pictures and whatnot, they tell a lot. Yes, it's been a great life.